Hi everyone, my name is Jay, and I am the founder of Tutor Nirvana. And today we will be going through the first video in our AP Biology course that we really hope will be an additional resource for any students that need it. And our first video is about the chemical structures of life. Let's jump right into it. And so it's really important for AP Biology students to really understand exactly what are the chemical elements that comprise all life. This eventually makes up the fundamentals of biochemistry, and in general, it's really important to understand how these basic molecules are essentially responsible for all life today, and life would not exist without these structures. And so looking at these two diagrams here, let's start with the one on the left. You'll notice that it starts out and it goes in order from smallest to largest, and the atom is the simplest particle or the simplest building block of matter. And so whenever you think of certain elements such as oxygen or carbon and things like that that are critical for life, the atom is extremely important. It is the smallest unit that comprises an element. So you can think of these as the most basic building blocks possible, from which basically comprise all living matter and all non-living matter as well. And these atoms can also combine and form things called molecules, which you'll notice here there's a molecule called dioxide where atoms of the same type can combine and form something known as a molecule, as shown here. And now, as we get more specified into life, atoms and molecules can conjoin and form something called a macromolecule. Now, macromolecules are extremely important in biology. These are essentially small particles within a cell that perform certain functions. For example, you can think of proteins, which in a cell are important for performing a wide variety of functions, such as structural support. These things are important in your muscle. And then also you'll notice here there's an example of a phospholipid, which is extremely important for upholding the structural integrity of cell membranes. And then that leads us to our next unit, which is known as a cell. And the cell is, you can think of a cell as almost, it's like the smallest structural unit of a living organism. And so plants, animals, all living things are comprised of these single units known as cells. And so, of course, cells are very critically important. And as we get deeper into biology, we'll see some of the deeper processes that are really important for the survival of living organisms. Groups of cells make up things known as tissues. And so tissues is our next structural element. And so tissues are usually what you think about when you think of, muscle or skin tissue or things like that. So in this example, it's showing epithelial tissue, which is the type of tissue that's responsible for our skin. This is just really important and is a collection of cells that cumulatively performs a certain function in the body or whatever the living organism needs it for. And tissues then cumulatively form things known as organs, which you're probably more familiar with. Most people know coming into AP Biology how tissues can group together to form organs. And so these organs are sort of the larger structural units that we think about when we think of the human body. So the lung, the heart, things like that. And now these organs can now group together to form something known as an organ system, which you're also probably familiar with. And so these are the systems, for example, we'll take the human body, that perform like unique aspects that are essential for the survival of an organism. So for humans, the respiratory system is essential for breathing. The urinary system is essential for excreting waste and maintaining blood osmolarity. And so it's really these organ systems that play the critical role and on a much larger scale that allows the organism to survive. And so now we finally reached the organism. So the organism is what we think of when we think of a singular living thing. So that could be a human or a frog or a bird. Organisms are, what we interact with, which is, obviously really, really interesting. As we go into the ecological concepts, a group of organisms eventually leads into something called a population. And so, as we'll learn in our ecology videos, a population is a group of a singular species of organism. So let's say we have a group of people, or you discover in your basement a colony of crickets or mice or something like that. So they're all the same species, but there's a large group of them. And now we have something called a community, which is our next step. And a community is basically a bunch of populations which can be of more than one type of species. So in here, the example is lions and zebras. So as long as we have populations of different species of animals, those cumulatively constitute a community. And next, we'll talk about the ecosystem. So an ecosystem is important because it involves not just a community, which is specifically tailored to species of animals, but both the biotic and the abiotic or non-living factors of life. So in an ecosystem, we might have, lions and zebras, but then we might also have the things that they interact with that are not necessarily living. So that might be things like, rocks and soil and things like that. So just the general environment. And then finally, all these ecosystems create the biosphere, which is essentially the composition of all life on Earth. So we have, a multitude of ecosystems throughout our planet, such as the tundra, the savanna, the tropical rainforest. All of these are abundant and fraught with life. And so together, this makes up all life on Earth. And so you'll notice we've started from the smallest unit, or the atom, and slowly built our way up to the biosphere. And all of these together constitutes all of life. And if you look at this diagram over here on the right side, you'll notice that there is an even further classification that most biologists use. And this is also, in this case, going from least specific to most specific. So we start with life, which is in general all things that are living. There's actually some really interesting debates on this, such as, for example, is a virus living or not? So people interested in biology are, interested in debating this type of question. But in general, life is things that are living. So what you think of when you think of something that's living versus not living. So, an animal or a plant versus a rock. And you'll notice that most life is, basically all life is divided into things known as domains. And so domains are what you think of when you think of, there are three main domains that are that biologists classify organisms in. They are the bacteria domain, the archaea domain, and the eukaryotic domain. So eukaryota is a domain that involves all eukaryotic organisms. So that includes animals and plants and things like that. The bacterial domain constitutes basically all bacteria. And then the archaea domain constitutes all archaea, which is another type of prokaryotic organism. So both bacteria and archaea constitute the prokaryotic organisms, which we'll talk about more when we get to cells, but essentially has to do with their cells that are much less complex than eukaryotic cells, such as they lack organelles. And the domain can then be divided into things known as kingdoms. And so each of these basically goes in order. So we go from life to domain to kingdom to phylum to class to order to family to genus to species. So I don't think for AP biology you really have to memorize this, but I think what you really should take away is just the big ideas, which is that life can be very broad and very specific. So overall, life is very, very broad and very, very vast. And biology as a subject is definitely very, very vast. But it can slowly be broken down into smaller and smaller pieces. And so I think for AP Biology, the students that really succeed are the ones who are able to break up the subject and not just see it as a bunch of random facts that you memorize, but rather how all of these, seemingly irrelevant facts, how they connect to really comprise what we know of as life. And so you don't really have to memorize necessarily all of these names, but you should be familiar with that. You should be familiar that life is broken up into many, complex fields, and understand how they all fit together. And so now let's get into the actual interesting scientific stuff of this unit, which is the unique chemical structures that make up life. And we'll start with something known as Chons plus P. And this is something I would recommend that you commit to memory. I definitely think it's important to know what these are. So we're going to I'm going to write this down. So the acronym that I like to go with is known as CHONS plus P. And essentially, these are the chemical elements that are basically critical for all life. So these are going to be the main elements you're going to find when you're looking, and it's really, really amazing because these elements comprise basically almost all living organisms, whether they're as different as like a bacteria found, at the bottom of the ocean versus a human being who lives on land. This is basically critical. These elements are critical for all life, regardless of what you are. And so that's why I think it's really important to know what they are. And so C stands for carbon, H stands for hydrogen, N stands for nitrogen, O stands for oxygen, P stands for phosphorus, and S stands for sulfur. And you'll notice as we get deeper into biology that each of these elements provides key roles in many important biological concepts. So for example, carbon is known as the building block of matter. I think it's special to note something about carbon is the fact that biological structures often have long chains of carbon, and that's mainly because of carbon's versatility as an element. Typically, carbon can be used to construct large chains of whether it might be proteins or it could be fatty acids and other biological structures. And another example is phosphorus. So phosphorus is commonly found in nucleotides, which are used to comprise DNA, if you've heard of that from basic biology classes. And sulfur is used primarily for also the synthesis of proteins. And so all of these elements here are used, and we'll talk more in depth about them as we get into deeper biological processes. But I think the main thing you should be aware of is these elements, trans plus P, are critical for all life. And when you have deficiencies in these, this severely affects the health of the organism. So you'll notice here that we have an example of carbon deficiency. And so here we have normal bone, which is, as we were saying earlier, this is when you have abundant numbers of carbon. But if you were to decrease the amount of carbon, you're basically decreasing the availability and stability of bones. And so in here, we have a disease known as osteoporosis, which is basically when we have a lack of carbon in the bones. And here you'll notice is another well-known deficiency, which is common in plants, and it's known as the boron deficiency. Now, boron isn't as essential. I'm sorry, guys. This is not a boron deficiency. This is actually, I messed up. This is a nitrogen deficiency. So nitrogen is one of our common elements, and it is also a very, very critical element for life, which makes sense because if you think about it, a large proportion of the atmosphere is made of nitrogen, and so many organisms have evolved to rely heavily on nitrogen. So when you take nitrogen away, you'll notice that this plant has some errors, right? I mean, it's wilting, it's the wrong shade, and that's mainly because there's a deficiency in the amount of nitrogen. And so I think the big idea I would take away from this concept is that when you have, is that these elements are always critical for life, and when you have a deficiency of any one of them, that severely weakens and threatens the health of the organism. Okay, so now that we've talked a little bit about some of the basic elements that make up life, let's look a little bit more in depth at the atom. So this right here is the structure of an atom. And so this isn't as important. This is more of a chemistry thing, but it is important to know the basic chemical structures when keeping in mind biological contexts. So you'll notice here that I think it's definitely worth it to know the basic structures of an atom. So in here, protons, of course, are the positively charged positively charged particles that make up an atom. The electrons are the negatively charged particles that make up an atom. And the neutrons are the neutral particles that make up an atom. And so just be familiar with what the components of an atom are. And you'll very likely probably not be tested exactly on, oh, what is a proton, what is an electron. But you will be expected to kind of know how these elements combine and basically work together to form life. Right here is actually not an atom, but a compound made up of 3 different atoms. This is H2O, or what you might commonly recognize it is water. And water, as we'll discuss in a little bit later, is extremely, extremely important. And it is not possible that life would exist without water. And this is why many scientists who are looking for evidence of life on other planets are mainly looking for the presence of water, because water is critical for life. And we'll discuss a little bit more later on. But you can see here, this is the structure of a common water molecule, and these denote the charges. So hydrogen is positively charged, and then oxygen is negatively charged. And so another key component of water is it's very polar. And we know it's polar because, as noted here, there's an uneven distribution of charges. This right here is a long carbon chain, which is very common in like fats. So this is like a common fat structure. And you'll notice that there's a very, very long chain of carbons. So this is like the organic chemistry structure of a chain of carbons or a fat. And so basically each of these bends, you could say, are made up of a carbon molecule. So there's a carbon, 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 etc. And so these long carbon chains basically contribute to increased levels of non-polarity. And this is very useful, for example, as we were talking about earlier in phospholipids, they are made up of these long chains of carbons, and because they are very, very nonpolar, this allows the inside of the cell membrane to be very, very nonpolar, and this is very important for life. It allows nonpolar molecules to pass through the membrane with relative ease, and it also prevents the cell from dissolving, because if the structural components that make up the cell were polar, and the cell was placed in an aqueous environment and it ended up dissolving, that would obviously be very detrimental for the cell, because you wouldn't want all your cells in your body to dissolve, obviously. So these long chains of carbons are found in life because to some extent they are able to contribute to nonpolarity and uphold stability in certain biological structures. You'll notice how the structure of water has 2 hydrogens. And basically, okay, and now we're going to get to some exciting stuff, because we're going to talk about what makes water so important. Water. Now, we all know what water is, something we drink every single day. But what we don't realize a lot of times is how critical water is for the maintenance and for the formation of life. And water has some extremely key properties, and life would not exist if we did not have these key properties of water. So let's go over some of them. And I think one of the most important ones is this one right here, this diagram. And basically, you should write this down. Water is, or I guess I should say, water, is less dense as a solid than a liquid. Or, as you might have heard it before, water expands as it freezes. Now, you might think of this as, okay, this basically is the reason why ice floats, right? Ice is water in its solid form, and then liquid water is, the water we see in lakes and streams. And so we might regard this as just as a bit of a curiosity, like, oh, cool, when I put ice cubes in my glass of water, the ice cubes will float to the top. Like, yay, that's great. But why is this actually important? Well, if you were to think about it, the very first life originated in the water. And this is primarily because the sun emits extremely dangerous levels of UV radiation and light, and it took a long time for organisms to evolve to the extent to where they could handle that that extent of UV radiation outside of the water. However, if when we look at this property of water, if water did not have this property, it would not be possible for life to exist. And why is that? Well, if you think about it, you'll notice that, let's say it's the winter time, and you go to a lake and you notice that it's frozen over. So what happens to all of the fish that live there? Well, if they were to just die out during the winter, that obviously wouldn't be a very sustainable population if the ice would just freeze everything solid. But what actually happens is during the winter, only this upper level of liquid water becomes ice. So this whole layer right here will all become ice. And so if that all becomes ice, we still have this preserved layer of liquid water underneath, where the fish and other organisms can live. And this is extremely important because with other liquids, what might happen if water did not have this property, like let's say water did not have this property, then during the winter, this entire section would all freeze solid. And if the entire section of the lake is frozen solid, there obviously can't be any sustainment of life. And so this is an important property that has allowed sustainment of life. And without this property, life would not exist. Now let's look at another property of water, which is known as surface tension. And more importantly, so this right here is a paperclip floating on water through surface tension. And basically all of the important properties of water can be summed up due to, if we go back to our previous slide, every important property of water is due to its ability to form hydrogen bonds. So let's say I draw a water molecule. So I'm going to draw two H's and an O. You'll notice that have the ability to hydrogen bond with the electronegative oxygen. Now, this is extremely important because when you have, millions and millions of water molecules, for example, right here, so we're going to have a ton of these water molecules, and they're all going to be hydrogen bonded to each other. And this property allows water to, I guess you could say, stick together in a way. And so this leads to the property of surface tension. All of the water molecules are stuck together through hydrogen bonds, which are not very strong bonds, but cumulatively, with millions and millions of water molecules forming these bonds, they can cumulatively grow to be pretty strong overall. And so that allows for the property of surface tension. So it allows the paperclip to float. And also you'll notice if you have, like, let's say a glass of water and you overfill it, the water will actually stick almost like to the side of the glass before it overflows, which leads to our next property of adhesion. But right now, let's just focus on surface tension. And so part of that reason is because instead of the water is not eager to just fall out, because it is held even when it's extended over the side of the glass, it is held by surface tension, or as we say, held by hydrogen bonds that make up the water molecules. Now, A couple more properties of water I want to talk about are, let's start with, and remember, these are also going to be linked to the property of water to hydrogen bond. Cohesion and adhesion. Now, these terms are essentially, they look daunting, but essentially they are extensions of the ability of water to hydrogen bond. And cohesion is specifically the ability of water to stick to itself. So I would write this down. So we're going to say, actually, what might be better? We'll start with cohesion only. So cohesion is the ability of water molecules to stick to themselves. And so cohesion is extremely important, and we'll see a real world example of this right here. So you'll notice there's this long tree. And so trees are really remarkable because they uptake water from roots. So they use their roots, to uptake water from the soil. So this is the soil. These are the roots. And they actually uptake water from the soil. And the water is able to go from the roots and travel all the way up the surface of the tree to the very top and reach every single branch and leaves. It's able to reach all of the leaves in the tree and provide that source of water, which is essential for life, as we said. Now, you might ask, how is it able to do that? Because if you think, we have these massive gravity forces pulling down, and somehow the tree needs to be able to pull this water up. Well, it's able to do that through a process known as transpiration, which is beyond the scope of biology, but we can briefly mention it here. And it uses the sun's energy to evaporate the top water molecules and basically pull the chain of water molecules up. But what's really important to know is that in this example, the reason why water molecules are able to be pulled up is because of the ability of cohesion. The water molecules are able to stick together and basically form a long chain that extends through this entire stretch. And so this entire stretch all the way here is just a long stretch of water molecules. And so it's basically like, to make an analogy here, let's say we have a line of people and they all lock hands, and so we have a long chain. And so if someone on the front of the line pulled on that line chain of people, everybody would move with it. And so basically the sun's energy is able to capitalize on this property and pull like the front water molecules, which are then able to pull all the water molecules starting from the very bottom. And so that's why cohesion is very important. There's also another property known as adhesion, which is basically the ability of water molecules, so the ability of water to stick to other substances. Now, these other substances are mainly going to be other polar substances. So, for example, a common example, as we were talking about, is if we had, let's go back to our glass of water. And you'll notice a lot of times water has the ability to kind of stick to the glass. And so that's why you sometimes see molecules of water that are just stuck to a glass. And it's because the ability of water is able to form hydrogen bonds sometimes with other substances. So for example, let's say the cup is made of glass. Glass is often made of a compound known as silicon dioxide. And so the water is able to form a hydrogen bond with this polar molecule and essentially stick to it. And so it's really important to understand these two concepts because they reflect water's ability to hydrogen bond and how that applies to living systems. So now that we've talked about some of the important properties of water, so there are a couple more I want to go over really fast. So another thing you should know is water has a, let's see, I'm going to erase some stuff here, and we'll talk about our last couple properties of water that you should be familiar with for this course. All right, so last couple properties you should know is water is known as the universal solvent. And it's known as this because it has an ability to dissolve numerous things, mostly polar things, because you should know the rule like dissolves like. And that's because water has the ability to dissolve polar substances. And this is extremely important if you think about the blood. The blood is made mostly of water, but there are also a multitude of dissolved substances. And so that's why it's so easy for the body to transport these substances, is because it has a liquid system made mostly of water that's able to dissolve these substances and then transfer them to wherever they need to go in the body. Another important property of water you should be familiar with is the fact that water has a high specific heat and a high heat of vaporization. Now these terms sound very like complicated, like, oh, super deep chemistry, but honestly they're very simple, and they again have to do with, you guessed it, water's ability to hydrogen bond. Now high specific heat, basically you can translate this as you need lots of heat to melt it, basically. You need a lot of heat to turn it from a solid to a liquid. For the high heat of vaporization, this is essentially you need a lot of heat to turn it from a liquid to a gas. And I think actually a better description of high specific heat, not just to melt, but more specifically, actually what I'm going to do here is, high specific heat is you need heat to raise the temperature of the water. Yes, this is more accurate. I'm sorry. So think of high specific heat as you need a lot of heat to raise the temperature of water, and the high heat of vaporization as you need a lot of heat to convert the water from a liquid form to a gas. Now you might ask, why is this important? Well, it's very important especially for marine organisms, that their environment stays relatively constant. And so water, you'll notice, doesn't change temperature very easily. So next time you go to the beach, you'll notice that if it's a very hot day, the sand is going to be really hot, but the water is still going to be cold. And the reason for that is because you need a lot of energy to raise the temperature of water even by a few degrees. And likewise, why do you think, likewise you need a lot of heat in order to turn water from a liquid to a gas. And so the reason for this is, as we've been talking about, hydrogen bonds. So this is something I really want to hammer into you guys' heads. Hydrogen bonds, hydrogen bonds, hydrogen bonds. You need a lot of energy to break all of the hydrogen bonds within a container of water. And that's why it's so difficult to raise the temperature of water, or even raise the temperature of water enough to convert it from a solid to a liquid, or a liquid to a gas. So keep those properties in mind. And now we've basically covered, I think, most of the things we need to know. All right, so more I'd like to go over. Go to our next slide. And so the next thing I wanted to talk about with you guys is the importance of carbon. So carbon. Now carbon, I think, is just, the reason I give it its own slide is because I think it's just really important to understand how valuable of an element this is. Now in chemistry, you'll probably learn things like how carbon has 4 valence electrons. It's able to form covalent bonds very, very easily, especially with itself. So I don't really think you need to know the specifics, but one thing I would know is just carbon has an ability to form more complex molecules. Or I should say more complex compounds. And so carbon has, you'll notice here that we have something known as a carbon ring. And so again, all of these pointy things represent separate carbon molecules. So we have a chain of carbons. And here you'll notice that each of these also represent a carbon. So here we have lots of carbons in a row, we have a ring of carbons, and here we actually have a chain of carbons as we were talking about earlier. So this whole thing is a long chain of carbons. Carbon, 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 carbon. And so carbon just in general has a tendency to form long chains of molecules. Now, another thing I wanted to really get in depth, which we can talk about later, is the importance of functional groups. This is something I would recommend you memorize, especially because many AP biology teachers do expect you to predict the properties of certain structures based on what functional groups they have. And so this is very important. I think the main properties you should be familiar with is probably polarity, and then possibly ionization as well. So the hydroxyl group is primarily, as you can see from the table, polar. And so you'll notice that hydroxyl groups are attached to many structures. So for example, a hydroxyl group is attached to the R group of the amino acid tyrosine, which is why some biologists believe that it has a tendency to, be slightly polar. Methyl groups are typically nonpolar. And then carbonyl groups are basically this thing, so C attached to an O. These are typically polar. Carboxyl groups are important because they have the ability to attach to and release a hydrogen. So these can actually be charged or neutral, and they can ionize in solution to release H+, which is why you'll notice that in many amino acids, these are called carboxylic acid groups, carboxylic acids. The amino group is another charged ionizable functional group that's also found in many proteins, and it can also uptake a hydrogen atom and become positively charged. Phosphate is important mainly because you'll see this, as we mentioned earlier, in nucleotides, so specifically DNA. And so this is why DNA is negatively charged, because it has negatively charged phosphate groups, which can release H+ ions into solution. And finally, we have sulfhydryl, which is a common group you'll find in proteins, and this is also polar. So I've explained basically the basic components of each of these functional groups, but I would recommend that you go through and memorize a table such as this, as I do feel it is a good idea to have a good understanding when approaching the AP Biology exam. We'll talk about these 4 in our next video, but these are essentially the 4 main macromolecules, which you'll remember when we were talking about the classifications of life. And so carbohydrates, proteins, nucleic acids, and lipids are the 4 basic building blocks that comprise life. And so carbohydrates you'll know as sugars. Proteins, of course, are the things that basically make up all life. They're the building blocks of life, which is, obviously, unsurprisingly, they have a lot of carbon. Nucleic acids are the genetic material that make up DNA and RNA. And then lipids are also known as, the structures of fat. And so these are what make up fat. So sugars, proteins, nucleic acids, and fats, which will be our focus for a future video. The last thing I wanted to talk to you in this video is the two processes that are very important and you'll find come up a lot. The first one is called dehydration synthesis. Also known as a condensation reaction. And our next one is known as hydrolysis. And this is important, so I would make sure you understand what both of these things do. But for me to break it down for you, these are essentially the two processes that allow us to build stuff and break stuff apart. So whenever you think of, the body or the cell is synthesizing a protein, or a cell is degrading a protein because it doesn't need it anymore, you should keep in mind these two processes. So with dehydration synthesis, or a condensation reaction, you'll notice the reason we call it dehydration is because we're actually dehydrating the compound. So we're losing a molecule of water, as you can see here. And so what happens is a hydrogen group is attached to one polymer, and a hydroxyl group is attached to the other monomer. And so, or it could be another polymer. And so what happens is, when we want to combine this structure with this structure, the hydrogen and HO groups actually combine. And when we have two hydrogens and an oxygen, what do we get? A water molecule, or a water compound, I'm sorry. So the H2O will exit as a molecule of water. And this process releases a molecule of water and also forms a stable covalent bond where 1, 2, and 3 are connected with 4, and we now have an even longer polymer. So this is the primary method that we use to synthesize compounds. And this is primarily, like you'll see it, for example, in proteins. You'll have numerous amino acids with a hydrogen group and a hydroxyl group, and they'll combine, they'll release a molecule of water, and boom, we now have an added structure. So this is known as dehydration synthesis, and I would definitely recommend you go over this and make sure you understand it. Now we can do the exact opposite when we want to break structures down. Now in this case, we're not losing a molecule of water. We're taking a molecule of water from the surrounding solution, and we're using that molecule of water to break up a long compound. So here we have a long structure, 1, 2, 3, 4, and we're adding a molecule of water, and adding this molecule of water actually breaks the bond. So we're breaking this stable covalent bond between two members of the polymer. And this water molecule will then subsequently break into its OH and H substituents. And now we have one polymer over here. So this becomes polymer 1 with the hydrogen group. And this becomes, I guess you could say it's a monomer, but monomer 1, and this has the hydroxyl group. And so we've used this water molecule to effectively split the bond between this overall large polymer. And so dehydration synthesis and hydrolysis are two processes that you definitely should be familiar with. So that concludes our first video on the chemical structures and some of the basic processes that you should be familiar with. And in the next video, we'll talk more in depth about some of these structures. And we'll also make sure to have a video where I've written some questions that I think really do a good job of testing some of these concepts. Because primarily, I want you guys to come out of this video really understanding what processes you need to know for the AP Biology exam and how to get the highest score possible that you need. Okay, well, thank you everybody so much for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to get more of these videos, and I hope this was helpful. And thank you so much, everybody.